Okay, great. Can everybody hear me? So my name is Betsy Hall, not related to Sharon Hall, despite having the same last name. And I'm the founder of For Their Thoughts Foundation. We focus on empowering families that are caring for their loved ones with dementia by providing relief, resources, and knowledge. We do not have our own resources. We reach out to the experts and to the resources, and our goal is to connect you with them. We also have a Care for the Caregivers program that provides financial relief and a navigation plan to help navigate through those resources. But before For Their Thoughts, I am also come from an FTD family. Both my mom and my grandmother were diagnosed with frontotemporal dementia, a genetic form in 2008, and they passed away in 2013. And so my family and we've gone through the turmoil of not just the caregiving, but of the navigating and trying to figure out what resources are out there. And we understand that our family's in the eye of the storm, knowing that we have a genetic form. And so research is very near and dear to our heart as well. And the Bluefield Project has been a beacon of light for my family, and I'm sure for many of you. And so I'm hoping that this webinar today is the start of many webinars connecting families, both FTD and other types of dementia, to those resources and get valuable information to you. But today we're going to start with research. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over. We have on the phone Laura and Andra from the Bluefield Project, and I'll let them introduce themselves. But thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks very much, Betsy, and thank you, Sharon. I'd really like to thank both of you for organizing this event and all of you on the call for attending. It's really our pleasure to be here, and I hope that you find our presentation today useful. So here it is. Great. So my name is Laura Middick. I'm the Chief Science Officer of the Bluefield Project, and I'm joined today with my colleague, Andrew Nicholson, who's the Director of Research Partnerships. And we are both basic scientists at the Bluefield Project, and we're hoping today to provide information about some interesting clinical studies that are underway, but really also to have an opportunity for you to ask us questions, and we'll try our best to answer them. Since it's, we'll hopefully cover things you're interested in, but you may have other things you'd like us to talk about. And I'll also say I have 14 slides today. I'll try to be as quick as possible and go through them at a high level. But Betsy will have them and Sharon will have them available to anyone who would like them after the call. So if you would like them, feel free to just not worry about taking notes, etc., because the information on them you can have access to after our call. So the Bluefield Project is a nonprofit foundation. We're headquartered in San Francisco, and we were formed in 2008. Our mission is to find a cure for frontotemporal dementia with a particular focus on FTD caused by mutations in progranulin. And today I'll talk a little bit about how we're trying to accomplish that mission. So Andrew and I, as I said, we're both basic scientists. We can't answer questions about medical questions, but hopefully we can share with you today an update about clinical research that we're really excited about. So the outline for today is a brief update about a conference that was last fall, and that was actually the genesis of when Betsy and I were speaking about giving an update. So I wanted to share a little bit about that conference, then give a high-level overview of what we do at Bluefield, and then ways to participate in clinical research opportunities, a brief discussion of genetic testing, and then open the floor for questions, which I know Sharon will remind us we should put in the chat. And you can put those in at any time, and she'll moderate those questions for us. So last fall, there was a conference held in Paris, which was the first one actually the FTD research community had since 2019, pre-COVID. And Betsy was really curious, I think, about what was being discussed and what updates were being provided there. And that was when she had reached out about providing an update to a larger group of interested people. about it. So I wanted to do that, Betsy, so you could see a little bit about what we do. These scientific conferences are really important for getting the larger, broader international community together to exchange ideas and provide updates. So here's the venue, and this was out in a town called Lille, outside of Paris. And I think the more interesting really slide I wanted to share here is on the right, which just shows the level of interest. You know, I think sometimes I can imagine that it might feel like this is such a rare disease, who's working on it, is there interest? And I think it's reassuring to see that there were over 650 participants in person attending this meeting. And it's also really interesting to see the breadth of countries that researchers came from. So, you know, the host country, France, had a huge number, almost 200. And the US is also always very heavily represented. The United Kingdom has a very strong FTD research program in many other European countries. But there's also, you know, really interesting to see people coming from Sierra Leone, you know, Angola, just all over the world. And I think that speaks to the increasing awareness of FTD as a disease. And I hope provides some encouragement, you know, that there are a lot of people that are really working hard on FTD. Or a couple photos. Most of the conference we spent listening to talks, and this is the main way that scientists and clinicians communicate with one another. Is they're 20-minute talks typically, and their research updates on what's going on in labs, in clinics, et cetera. It's a really effective way to communicate rapidly a lot of information. We also present posters, and you can kind of see one down here a little bit. These are very interactive opportunities where the poster author will stand in front of their poster and you can come and talk to them and ask questions. And so these conferences are really important for disseminating information, creating new hypotheses, and moving the field forward. So we were very excited to have this meeting be in person again post-COVID. One of the questions we sometimes get, and you know, Betsy as well was asking, well, what happened at the conference? And so I wanted to share that Twitter is actually a great source for staying up to date on what's going on in the FTD research community. So these are some posts just at the meeting that happened. You can see that there are different groups. The Bluefield Project was posting. There are different societies that post. Natural history studies maintain Twitter accounts that post. Leading researchers, companies post on Twitter. You know, other advocacy organizations post, individual researchers post. These are just a few examples. And I think I would encourage you, if you do really want to have a detailed, to follow along in more detail what's going on in the research community, I would invite you to explore Twitter. And you know, you can go to the Bluefield Project's Twitter page, for example, and see who we follow and start from there, following other people that you might be interested in following for FTD research. So I think sometimes people are, I'm sure that people have Instagram accounts, there's LinkedIn accounts, et cetera, but I think sometimes it's a surprise, and it was to me actually initially, how much communication happens among scientists. On Twitter, they actually often will post when they have a new paper that's come out or a new advance. Companies will post about you know, shareholder updates about trials, things like that. So it's an effective way to stay informed. Okay, so that's my little blurb about the meeting, and there is also a caregiver conference component to this meeting, and unfortunately it runs in parallel with the scientific sessions. So I've never actually attended it, but I hope that the individuals that attended that found it as useful as well, but I can't actually speak to that portion of the meeting. Okay. So to share a little bit of background about Bluefield itself, so we were founded in 2008, and at the time there wasn't really much known about about FTD in general. C9, for example, had not been linked as a disease gene at that point, but we had a focus initially on enabling the development of therapeutics. We still have this focus, the development of therapeutics for FTD, but especially for FTD caused by mutations in progranulin. We do fund a variety of work that is across all genetic forms of FTD or even sporadic FTD, but I want to make it clear that we do have a vested interest in funding efforts to develop therapeutics for progranulin deficient FTD. And so I think those are really will be most qualified to answer questions in that space. So the way we've gone about this since 2008 is initially we really funded a lot of academic research, and we still do fund academic research. At any given time, we fund probably 15 to 20 different academic researchers, mostly in the US, but also overseas in Europe, to study aspects of FTD, both basic science mechanisms at the cellular level, as well as clinical research. And over time, that led to an increasing number of publications, which led to the ability of us to really start to engage with pharma and biotech. And in the medical community, most drug development happens in the private sector, in pharma and biotech. And so we wanted to get the science and the research that was happening in the academic environment into, to get the interest of pharma and biotech companies. And for progranulin FTD, which is our main focus, that has been successful. We've continued to fund initiatives to support clinical efforts, but we're really excited that there are a number of companies that are developing therapeutics for progranulin deficient FTD. And in fact, there are now 4 companies that are testing experimental drugs in humans in clinical trials. And I'll talk a little bit more about these clinical trials later on. But, I think this is just sort of a highlight slide about what Bluefield is. Our overall goal is to support research and all kinds of research, but with this goal of doing what we can to help ensure that clinical trials can be run and can be successful. So now is a really pivotal time in the drug development process where the participation of so many people over the years in clinical research has really, and it may be some of your family members on this call that have participated in observational, possibly even current clinical trials or past clinical trials, that their participation has led to this extremely pivotal time that we're in right now. Where we have a number of very promising promising therapeutics that are being tested in the clinic, and just an enormous amount of interest in this disease. And I think, I can imagine that when you're in the weeds of a clinical research participation, you're traveling, it's difficult, it's burdensome, that it might be really frustrating to think, where did my samples go? Where did my scans go? Does this actually do anything? And I want to reassure and just emphasize that yes, it is the foundation of all of the drug development and all of the clinical work that's going on for FTD. It all comes from the participation of patients and their families participating in clinical research, and the importance of that really can't be overstated. That said, we recognize, of course, that participating in clinical research is not for everyone. It can be very challenging, and but I wanted to just stress that for all of the hard work that goes into families participating in clinical research, it is just extraordinarily, we're extraordinarily grateful for those efforts. So on the next slides, I would just want to highlight some of the current ways to participate in clinical research. So many of you may be familiar with current observational studies, and just to explain, observational studies are exactly that. They're an opportunity to observe patients, individuals with FTD, or at risk of FTD. They do not administer any drugs, and current observational studies that you might be familiar with are all FTD, which I'll talk about in more detail, a Bluefield sponsored initiative called the Neurofilament Surveillance Project. And then in many universities, there are local studies looking at different aspects of the disease or different potential areas. And so there are a lot of different studies going on in different places that I'm not going to cover, but those are also vitally important for understanding this disease and how to test it, how to treat it. Then now we're very fortunate to have a number of clinical trials, and all of these really observational and clinical, which I've called here clinical trials, they're all clinical studies. But we now have this opportunity to talk about interventional trials, also called treatment trials or experimental trials, where researchers are really testing ways to prevent or treat disease. And this might include new drugs or new surgical procedures or different ways to use existing treatments. And today I'll just briefly touch on some of the drug studies. And there are other studies going on with different types of interventions like transcranial stimulation and whatnot that I won't talk about. But I think, there are a lot of opportunities out there, and it's good to talk with physicians who may be able to speak more directly to those kinds of studies. So to go back to the observational studies, many of you may be familiar with the All-FTD Clinical Research Network. This really is the hub of FTD research in the United States in particular. There are now, I think, 24 sites that participate in All-FTD, and if someone is interested in participating in the All-FTD study, the website is listed up here, and the clinical coordinators for each of these sites their emails are available, and you can reach out to them and tell them you'd like to learn more, and they will contact you and provide additional information. This study is usually a multi-day site visit, and participants take a number of cognitive tests, neuropsychiatric tests, may have an MRI done, and also provide biospecimens like blood or cerebral spinal fluid. So it's just incredible. This is an NIH funded study. I think they received over $60 million from the government over a 5-year period it is to conduct this study. It's just incredibly important, and it's really the foundation of so much of the advances that we have in this field. Participants do not need to know their genetic status to participate in this study, and it also, individuals may have sporadic FTD, or they may have a genetic form of FTD, and they may either be symptomatic or a member of a family. They may be at risk to develop FTD, but asymptomatic. And so it's a very inclusive study. So I would encourage anyone that's interested to look at that website if you haven't already. Now, one of the really great things that's happened over the last few years, and I touched upon this in that early slide, is just the increase in the international collaboration of groups looking at FTD. So All-FTD here is shown on the map. The original, or one of the earliest studies, natural history studies, was GenFi, which I think now is in over 10 European countries and Canada, and continues to expand. But then there are really newer consortia that are forming as well, one called REDLAT, which I believe is in 5 or 6 countries in Latin America. There are well-established networks in Australia and New Zealand, and then there are a number of developing networks across Asia. There's still regions of the globe where we don't have consortia looking at FTD, although I'm sure there are individual researchers there. But I think I wanted to highlight this because the reason why these international efforts are so important is because FTD is such a rare disease that we really need all organizations and the whole community working together and collaborating so that we can obtain enough data to really have, the sort of the statistical power to understand what's happening in this disease. And many companies are opening clinical trial, treatment trial sites around the world because it is difficult to find participants for interventional trials. And so it's really important that that people around the world have access to these treatment trials, and that at these treatment trial sites, the researchers are collecting data in the same way so that the data can be combined and interpreted. So Bluefield supports some of these efforts around the world, and we really are just so grateful to work in a community that a research community where there is so much collaboration. So one of the exciting discoveries that's come out of all of these clinical studies and all of the participation of so many patients and families over the years is the identification of the importance of biomarkers to help in the design and interpretation of clinical trials. And I'll just speak briefly here about one in particular that's receiving a lot of focus right now, and it's a protein called neurofilament light chain. Neurofilaments are normally just found in the brain in a healthy individual. They're a structural component of axons, which are a part of a neuron in the brain. And they are, when an individual experiences any kind of brain injury, so it could be like a traumatic brain injury from a car accident, something like that, or a stroke, or they have any kind of degenerative brain process going on, like FTD, neurofilaments actually are released from the dying neurons during that process, and they actually can be detected in cerebrospinal fluid quite a lot, but a little bit actually makes its way out into the bloodstream, where neurofilament can be detected in by very sensitive assays. It's been a real major achievement in the field that these very minute levels of neurofilament can be detected in the blood. And so the reason why this is really important and of huge interest right now is because it seems like in carriers, particularly of genetic FTD mutations, neurofilament in the blood may begin to increase shortly before clinical symptoms begin. So this is important because ideally one would want to receive treatment as soon as there's any evidence that the disease process is beginning, because we can't predict the disease process in genetic FTD. In sporadic FTD, it's really important as a blood test because it helps to rule out some other kinds of neurological disorders. So there's a lot of interest in trying to understand neurofilament and levels and what it actually means. From a understanding the disease perspective. From a treatment trial perspective, it's also really important to understand neurofilament because ideally, if a drug is effective, one might anticipate that it slows the release or it stops the release of neurofilament into the blood because neurons should hopefully be protected from injury or from dying from the disease process. So right now, this is a very topical protein that's being studied heavily, including by a study here by Bluefield. We manage this study. It's called the Neurofilament Surveillance Project, and it's actually a sub-study of all FTD, of the larger all FTD. Individuals have to enroll in all FTD in order to participate in this study. And it's a blood collection study, but it's a high frequency blood collection study. So we're trying to collect blood from participants 4 times a year for 3 years. And the reason why, so if you participate in all FTD, you donate blood once a year. The reason why we'd like to look at blood 4 times a year is because it's more akin to what happens in a clinical trial. Clinical trials are run on shorter timelines, and one might expect to see changes in neurofilament more quickly than over the course of a year. You might expect to see them in 3 to 6 months. And so that's why we're trying to understand neurofilament's behavior on this shorter timeline so that the information can be used to interpret whether or not clinical trials are whether or not an investigational drug might be having an impact. It's also a way to really, this study is also trying to understand the timeline of when neurofilament increases with disease onset. So this is a study that's focused just on genetic FTD, and you do not need to know your genetic status to participate in this study. It enrolls individuals that have mutations or individuals that do not have mutations. Everyone is from families with these 3 known mutations are invited to participate. And this is an interesting study because it's actually funded by 11 companies and 3 foundations, including the Bluefield Project. So there's a lot of interest in trying to use biomarkers as a way to better understand and better treat FTD. So lastly here, we wanted to touch on current interventional trials. So These are trials that are currently underway mostly in the United States. Some are not quite open yet in the United States, but have plans to be. And I think, there's a lot of information about these trials. So this is more just to make sure that anyone on the call is aware that there are treatment trials and in genetic and sporadic FTD. And so for progranulin, for example, there are 4 trials here that are currently recruiting, although this last one by Denali Therapeutics and Takeda is not available yet in the United States, but hopefully will be this year. There's another trial that is not yet recruiting, but again, also will hopefully be later this year. So for FTD caused by expansions in C9 open reading frame 72, there are 2 trials that are underway right now, although WAVE's trial is not available in the United States yet, but hopefully will be, at least last time I checked, which was actually a couple of months ago. But the phase 2 with Transposon Therapeutics is available in the United States. And then there are ongoing trials in sporadic FTD. So, I think we hear a lot, well, why are there not more trials in sporadic FTD? And the reality is just the biology behind when there's a known mutation in the gene, it provides an entry point to try to target the biological processes that go wrong in the disease. And so that's why there's just much more interest because it's easier to target when there's a known mutation. However, the hope would be that as we learn how to run clinical trials in FTD, as we learn about the biology of the disease, that some of these learnings will translate into helping sporadic FTD. An important distinction is that the experimental trials underway for progranulin F and C9 are expected to be disease modifying trials, which means that they actually target the molecular deficiencies, the things that are going wrong in individuals that carry these mutations and are symptomatic with the disease. And that is a key advance that why participating in these trials may impact an individual's disease currently. The sporadic FTD trials, for the most part, probably with the exception of the first one, are more treating the symptoms of FTD. They're not treating the actual molecular changes in the disease. So a key point to know is that to participate in these interventional trials, for the most part, individuals must be symptomatic. There's one exception for progranulin, and individuals need to know that they carry a mutation in the gene. And we'd be happy to talk about these as well, or provide information on how you can talk to the companies, get in touch with the companies. But in general, we always recommend that you speak with your physician, your loved one's physician about these trials if you're interested. So as I just mentioned, to participate in these trials, these interventional trials in the genetic forms of FTD, one needs to know their genetic status. There are a number of ways to obtain genetic testing. You can certainly go and talk to your physician and go through traditional routes with your physician to obtain testing. There are also free programs that are sponsored by drug companies, and Bluefield as well has a sponsored genetic testing program underway. There are differences in each of these programs, which are important to consider. And again, these slides will be available after the call so that you can review these. And then as noted down here, the registry also has all of these programs listed and is a great place to go for additional information. I think one of the benefits of these programs is that they offer pre-test genetic counseling. So if you are interested, but not quite convinced or not, you're wondering more, you want to learn more about genetic testing, I think the opportunity here to take advantage of pre-test genetic counseling is an important one. And there is never any obligation to proceed through the pathway. You may decide at the end of your pre-test genetic counseling session that you're not interested in pursuing any more information about possible genetic status. So I think, you know, these are great opportunities right now that are available to potentially consider genetic testing. And then lastly, we're at the end here. I wanted to just remind you again about the registry, which is a great, Bluefield co-funds this. We co-founded this with the Association for Frontotemporal Degeneration, and also funded by the Rainwater Foundation. And we always encourage that you can both learn more about all of the studies that we talked about today, and then also genetic testing information is available in the FTD resources section of that website, and it's just a good place to find additional information. So I wanted to, again, thank everyone. Here are our emails, and Andra, if he's on the call with me here, Andra was a researcher in Rosa Rodemaker's lab, and Rosa was a key person in the discovery of both C9 and progranulin mutations being causative for FTD, and she actually has a wealth of information. So between the two of us, hopefully we'll be able to answer your questions. Here are our email addresses as well. You're welcome to reach out to us if you have additional questions. Just before we start the questions, I'd love to also just acknowledge our colleagues here at the Bluefield Project, and then all of the many investigators, our advisors, and our board of directors that support us. And then, whoops. Okay, I thought I used to have I must not have, the other people I'd like to acknowledge again are just our colleagues across the world, and then the other foundations in this space. And again, Sharon and Betsy for inviting us. So with that, I think we can open the floor, or Sharon, you can relay some of the questions.
Yes, we have a couple of questions in the chat. Kate wants to know, do your biotech partners provide funding to Bluefield researchers, or is Bluefield funding biotech research?
Oh, that's a great question. So, so Bluefield is funded by one family, basically, that has a vested interest in this disease. And we really use that money primarily to fund academic research, and also to fund discrete initiatives that support the clinical work that's going on in pharma. But we don't fund pharma and biotech directly, nor does pharma and biotech fund us. With the exception of studies like the Neurofilament Surveillance Project, which I mentioned. That is a pre-competitive consortium where many companies are funding that study together and sharing and exchanging information. It's non-competitive, pre-competitive. So, no, the easy answer to the question is no. Actually, we fund everything ourselves. We don't have a model. There are other foundations that do fund a lot of industry work, and we're very fortunate that there's been just incredible interest in pharma and biotech, in particular in progranulin deficient FTD, and those companies raise money themselves, either through venture capital if they're a startup company, or if they're a larger pharma company that's coming through their normal pipeline channels. Yeah.
The second part of our question, I think you probably already touched on this. Did the biotech companies play a role in hosting these clinical trials? Yes.
So, so for therapeutic clinical trials where there's an actual drug that's being an experimental drug that's being tested in humans, those are paid for by the biotech and pharma companies. Clinical trials are extraordinarily expensive. Hundreds of millions of dollars go in generally into running a clinical trial, a large clinical trial. So that money all comes, that's part of this complex discussion around why are drugs so expensive in this country, and why is this whole industry so resource intensive. And that's part of the reason why, because testing in humans, the cost of that, of all the ones that I mentioned for interventional trials, therapeutic trials, it's all covered by, the costs are all paid for by the companies themselves.
And Betsy has asked to confirm, to provide blood to NSP for the neurofilament, you need to be a part of all FTD?
Yes, that's correct. So, so the reason that is because the Neurofilament Surveillance Project is collecting blood 4 times a year for 3 years. And that information itself is very interesting and important, but that the information of neurofilament needs to be connected to information about the disease. So all FTD, when participants come in annually and they get an MRI or they take a bunch of tests, there's a lot of clinical assessments that happen. That information is correlated, it's matched to NFL levels, because NFL by itself is interesting, but we need to understand, how does NFL relate to all the other things that we're looking at that are a measure of the disease progression and onset, so that we can actually understand what NFL is telling us. So that's why you have to be enrolled in all FTD, because the data that happen at those annual visits in all FTD are used in part to understand what's going on with neurofilament that's being measured every quarter. So yes, you must be enrolled in all FTD to be enrolled in the neurofilament surveillance project.
And Sandeep says, where in India can I enroll for any clinical trials for BVFTD? I see in one of the slides, RedLat India collaboration. What is this for?
Yes, so the investigator is at NIMHANS in Bangalore, and her name is Sravana Aladi. You're welcome to email me and I will give you her contact info. She is leading that Indian network. And I actually am not familiar with the details of the collaboration with RedLat, but Dr. Aladi is in Bangalore, and she is the center of that FTD developing network in India. So I'd be happy to provide her contact information to you if you want to email me at my address right here on the screen.
And Hillary said she would really love for all FTD to follow her, but her mother is the only known family member with FTD, so was turned down by Columbia. Is getting her own genetic testing done the only way to potentially move forward?
Well, so all FTD does enroll sporadic. We call it, so if I understand the question correctly, there's no family history, then that would be considered a sporadic FTD case, and we don't really understand why FTD develops in individuals. There may be a combination of genetic factors, there may be environmental factors. It's really just not clear. So if her mom is the only individual in the family with FTD, is that correct, Sharon? Is that how you interpret the question?
Yeah, that's the way she said, but my mother is the only known family member. What she's saying is, I would really love for all FTD to follow her, but her mother is the only known family member with FTD.
Sorry. Yes, unfortunately, if there's no evidence of a genetic link, then I think that all FTD is not, there's no sort of quote, no reason to follow her, right? Because the assumption is that the mom's FTD is sporadic and will not be passed to offspring. So she would not be of interest to be followed in the study, if that makes sense.
But if Hillary were to have genetic testing and found to have a gene, would she then be eligible for all FTD?
Yes, absolutely. Anyone who's a carrier of a mutation would.
So I think that probably answers your question there, Hillary.
Yeah, well, I can jump in one further, maybe, Sharon, that I think getting herself tested isn't the only option if her mother is still around and willing to get tested. So if she doesn't want to be unblinded herself as to what her genetic status is, I think to know for sure that her mom carried a gene would be to get her mom tested if she's able to do so.
I hope that answers your question, Hillary. If you have an additional one, you could put it in the chat. How many more clinical trials for progranulin mutations would be available to participants in the next 5 years? How close are other companies to bringing solutions or potential disease modifiers?
That's a really great question. And Andrew and I spend much of our days working on supporting and hopefully making sure that there are many clinical trials that are available in the future for progranulin mutation carriers as well. I mean, I think we would like to see, it's one of the kind of the paradoxes of drug development. We would like to see, we are very hopeful that the current trials will be successful and those drugs will be approved. They're very promising antibody drugs, gene replacement and protein replacement therapies that are being tested in the clinic right now. And once, the way drug development works, once there are approved drugs, you might think that that would actually discourage companies from being in the space. But one of the hardest things in the drug development process is getting an interpretable result and having a path through the regulatory process, which is working with the FDA, so that the FDA is convinced that this drug had a therapeutic benefit and they approve it. And once they approve it, then insurers, payers in our healthcare system will hopefully insure the drug so that individuals can access it through their insurance programs. And it becomes, it's safe. FDA has approved it to be safe and effective. And so that for cognitive disorders and behavioral disorders like FTD, the regulatory pathway is complex because showing that there's an impact on cognition and behavior is a challenge. And so once I think there are approved drugs, it will actually result in more companies being interested in continuing their clinical trials if they're already in the space or potentially pursuing additional approaches. So, what I can say is there are a number of companies that have publicly disclosed programs, different approaches. There are antisense approaches, there are small molecule approaches, there are additional gene therapy companies in the progranulin space that are all working on programs that they hope to be able to bring to the clinic. And we very much hope that, there are no guarantees, but we very much hope that there will be a number of those that will follow in the next few years, the current companies that are in the space.
A high-level opinion question here for you. Can you speak at all to the progress or the hope factor on some of the C9 or progranulin studies?
It's pretty much the same question, but just curious on that.
Yeah, I think, and Andrew, feel free to chime in here too. I think we have tremendous hope. I think that this is a very rare disease, and to have this much commercial interest, company interest, industry interest in this space is extraordinary. And the approaches that companies have developed are highly targeted, very precise approaches that really target the molecular dysfunction, the deficiency in these diseases. And so, the hope is that because they have focused right in on the actual problem, the hope is that they will provide therapeutic benefit. The concern, I think the hesitation that is very real is that what we see in many diseases like Alzheimer's or Huntington's disease is that it's very important to treat people as early as possible. And I think that in some of these early trials where individuals may be pretty far progressed when they first start taking the drug, unfortunately we don't really know, but the brain doesn't seem to have a lot of regenerative powers, right? It's not like the liver that can regenerate. And so the concern is if you treat too late, that it might not be as beneficial. And so I think that is what the field and all of us will, when trial results are disclosed, hopefully in the first one in the next year or so, then we have to put the trial results into the context of all of these kinds of things, because there are definitely, I think that's the kind of thing where the results may not necessarily, the early results may not necessarily match the hope, but that doesn't mean that the drug isn't highly effective or didn't work. It's just that these are very heterogeneous populations that we run drug trials in, and especially in the earliest drug trials, And so that's something that we have to kind of keep in mind as we think about how would we improve these trials down the road. And you see that in the Alzheimer's field, where they've progressively moved trials into earlier and earlier stages, the same for Huntington's disease. And it's part of the drug development pathway. And it's very frustrating if you're sick right now, you know, or your loved one is sick, that you wanted them to be treated earlier, and it just happens in a kind of slow process as the drug moves through these sort of life cycles of it, for lack of a better description.
Can you speak to overlapping of proteins of neurodiseases, of Alzheimer's, FTD, the proteins that overlap? I don't know if that's within your realm, but you certainly go ahead.
And Andrew, I see you unmuted there too. I suspect I know what you might want to talk about. Why don't you take that one?
Sure. I mean, there's between FTD disorders, there's overlapping proteins, and then there's overlapping proteins between non-FTD dementias and FTD dementias. So, I mean, tau, as many of you may already know, is found to aggregate not only in some forms of FTD, but also in Alzheimer's disease. And so drugs, you can imagine that drug development for tau disorders might be of interest to pharmaceutical companies because they could target both FTD and Alzheimer's disease. There's also a protein known as TDP43. This is the protein known to aggregate pretty much in everybody with a progranulin gene mutation, as well as in most cases with C9, but it can also be found in Alzheimer's disease as well. So again, you know, targeting this protein is thought to be a potentially promising avenue because it again goes across multiple disorders. Is there a specific question about a specific protein?
If there is a specific protein you're interested in, Wanda, if you could put that in the chat, we'll ask about that. Sandeep said, due to some reasons for now, I'm not able to do genetic testing of my wife. My daughter is 2 years old. Shall I go ahead and do her genetic testing? If the gene is found in my daughter, is there any way the genes can be modified at this stage?
Yeah, so I think that that's a really good question, and how to handle anyone under 18 is a very sensitive topic. I would suggest talking to your physician about this because the current genetic testing programs that we're familiar with and we are aware of are only available for those that are over 18. There's a lot of implications to giving a genetic diagnosis to someone that young, but I'm sure that your physician could provide more, or a genetic counselor for that matter, could provide more insight into implications of genetic testing in kids.
I want to ask,
I'd also just add, Sharon, that I would discourage you from considering testing your child, but I would also argue that even if your child is a negative result, it doesn't necessarily prove that your wife is negative, right? Because your child may not have inherited the diseased allele from her mom. So I just, for many reasons, I would discourage you from that path. But I think Andrew's advice to talk with a physician or genetic counselor is really important.
I would like to ask, we just went through Probably Genetic and to have our genome looked at. And I noticed that when I went back into their site, that there's not, we were part of, I guess, a group of people that were able to do it without expense. But I see now that perhaps they are charging for that. Could you, if you know about the Probably Genetic, could you just kind of clarify what that is?
Sure. So, and Laura, I don't know if you want to go to the genetic testing slide. So it's actually on that slide, that program. So Probably Genetic is a company that Bluefield has partnered with for the Bluefield sponsored genetic testing project. And this should be for anyone that qualifies for genetic testing through our sponsored program with Probably Genetic, should not have any costs associated with their experience. So this cost should cover the genetic test, as well as pre-genetic counseling. So genetic counseling before you take the test to talk about the risks and benefits, as well as post-test genetic counseling. So this is a second counseling session that you would have after your results are ready and your results are given to you in the presence of a genetic counselor. But thanks for the question, Sharon. It should all be free.
So when you go to probablygenetic.com, it is, right? Is it .org? I'm having a brain lapse here.
It's a .com. Thank you, Laura.
It's a .com, and there is a form to fill out where you have to say if there's any neurodegenerative disease in your family and who that is, and so those are the things that qualify you to be able to have the testing free, as I understand it. And is that correct?
So our genetic testing program through the Bluefield Project is unique, and because we are allowing individuals who are symptomatic, so you have to be symptomatic to go through this program, who are diagnosed with FTD or who are potentially not diagnosed with FTD. And the thought behind this is that many people and many families go through a very long diagnostic journey where it takes many years to get an FTD diagnosis. And what we've developed with Probably Genetic is a symptom checker. So when you go to the website, and it's listed in the bottom middle of this table, you will have a series of questions about your symptoms. So we kind of have two groups that we are testing in this project: those that are FTD diagnosed and those that are not diagnosed with FTD but are having symptoms. And everyone takes the same questionnaire. So we can learn from those with FTD what symptoms you have, and can we take that information and identify others that have similar symptoms and might not have their diagnosis yet. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So everyone has to go through the same questionnaire, but the eligibility piece is a little bit different if you have an FTD diagnosis or if you are undiagnosed.
We're kind of coming up on an hour here, and Betsy has put in the chat, if there's a form, a link there to a form, if you have additional questions or comments, and you want to make sure that you get a link to this Zoom in case you did not sign up through Eventbrite, please fill out that form and you will have access to this recording. So if you'll please fill out that form if you did not go through Eventbrite. If you went through Eventbrite, then we have that information and you will have access to the recording of the Zoom. Betsy also wants to know what's the best way to stay updated on summary results of ongoing trials. For example, if I wanted to keep abreast on the progranulin studies and how they are doing, what's the best way and how often are results available to the public?
Great question. I think the best way would be to follow companies' social media outputs, or to go to the company's websites. So companies provide shareholder updates regularly, and they usually post those in the news section of their website. There will be shareholder updates and their slide decks that are available. And you can go through and they'll have an update on the trial. The way clinical trials work, they are pre-specified points where things are evaluated, like safety and potentially some early results, and that can help determine whether the trial proceeds. But the actual trial data are not reported until the very, very end in a public announcement after the data have been evaluated. So it is a long process, especially some of these gene therapy trials. It's a very long process. So there'll be initial results and then longer results on safety in those gene therapy trials. But the easiest way to stay up to date is probably to go to the website and look in the news section and look for for the public company shareholder updates. For the private companies, I think, do we have any of those? I guess we do, yes. It would be to follow their social media and then also check their websites, yeah. investigators are blinded. So all the doctors that you're seeing, et cetera, they will not have any information. They're all blinded, and everyone's blinded, and that's on purpose, right? So, yeah, you have to go through the company to get the information.
Yeah, I also would like to encourage people that if you do have FTD in the family, if you are looking at that genetic testing, we had a very positive experience with probablygenetic.com. We had a pre-counseling and we had a positive result resulting in a post-genetic counseling. We had someone that had a negative and they just got their results because it was negative, and so there wasn't a post counseling, but it was a very good experience. I also will encourage any of you that have FTD in the family and the person with FTD to have brain donation. This is a very important thing to advance research, to have a brain donation. Oftentimes when you're diagnosed clinically with FTD, because that's the only way we are diagnosed at the present time, when you are clinically diagnosed with FTD, you may find astounding results at brain donation when you actually find out that your loved one didn't have FTD, but had Alzheimer's or some other degenerative disease. So it's very important for brain donation. Oftentimes when you're involved in a study, that is part of the study, but you can also do brain donation aside from a study. And I just want to make sure that people know that and to absolutely become involved. It's important for us to be part of this research for future generations. Obviously, a lot of families that are affected will have children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren down the line who may very well be affected as well. So please be involved if you can. I want to thank the Bluefield Project for being so open and telling us exactly what this is all about, because it can be very, very confusing. And I want to thank Betsy for having this come together. And if you have to want any questions, please go to either Bluefield or go to Betsy at For Their Thoughts Foundation and ask any questions that you might need to ask there. Thank you again to everyone for attending, and we hope that some of this has been very beneficial to you in knowing more about research. So look for the link, and thanks for attending, and we hope you learned something today. Thank you.